I got a new set of oil pastels and I can't stop using them. Today I'm trying out these soft oil pastels by Arrtx for portraits, and I'll be combining them with my Mungyo Gallery oil pastels to see how this mixed approach works, and if they have advantages or weaknesses that I can balance this way. And because it's always more fun to use movies or fan art in general for practice, I'll be drawing Baela and Rhaenyra from House of the Dragon. To properly compare the two oil pastel brands, I'll change my approach for each portrait. While both portraits will mix the two oil pastels, Baela will be mostly painted with the Arrtx soft oil pastels, and then for Rhaenyra I will use more of the Mungyo Gallery soft oil pastels. I had already prepared the pencil sketches for both portraits while catching up on the show, so I was ready to start. The ugly stage for this portrait took me forever to get through. I hope you can learn something from my mistakes as I paint this. For starters, I kept it simple. I shaded in some key colors both on the brightly lit side of her face and in the transition area where the shadow sculpts the face. These oil pastels are incredibly soft, so the barest touch is enough to get some color on the page, and I then blended out the color using paper stumps. Blending out the colors like this covers the white bumps of the paper texture without using too much of the oil pastels, and once blended, it's easier to layer on top. Minimal pressure with the blending stump was more than enough for these oil pastels. I noticed my first mistake. I'd used the light brown color for these transition shadows, and the color has a grey undertone that becomes more visible once blended out. I think there might be some white or black pigment in there to tone the brown down into this muted shade, which looks beautiful but made her skin tone look way too ashen and a bit sickly. I went in with more vibrant colors, reddish browns and yellow ochre shades to bring back liveliness and saturation. Layering with these oil pastels feels incredibly pleasant and intuitive, and since this was a great opportunity to practice portrait drawing in general, I loved that I could go in and adjust, paint over and blend endlessly. I'm drawing on this oil pastel paper pad by the Korean brand Samwon, a part of their Art Square line, which seems to be a collaboration with Fabriano, but I can't find this paper anywhere but in Korean art shops. I want to recommend it anyway since it's got a beautiful texture, the paper is very heavy and feels wonderful to work on, it is very cheap, and there are coated papers in between the pages to make sure the oil pastels don't get too messy. If you're ever in Korea, keep your eyes open for this. When I filled in the background with black, I actually used too much of the oil pastel. Using a paper stump like a palette knife, I pushed the oil pastel into the paper and blended it out smoothly. While it felt amazing to fill in the background so quickly with this buttery texture, I didn't need this much pigment, oil and wax when it came to blending, and you can see that the background turned out to be quite thick and a bit uneven. Lesson learned for the next time, less is more, and a little of these goes a long way when blending. Speaking of paper stumps, I also like to use a small paper stump to scrape off oil pastel directly from the oil pastel stick and apply it that way for details and highlights. I let the first portrait rest for a moment and started on the second one, Rhaenyra. Here I used the Mungyo Gallery soft oil pastels to start. Now, before going into any comparisons of texture or blending, I have to give a big disclaimer. I own way more Mungyo pastels than Arrtx colors. The Arrtx set comes with 48 shades, while for Mungyo I have their 72 color box, and on top of that I bought a lot of their more muted, softer shades as single sticks. A lot of art shops here in South Korea sell Mungyo as open stock, since it's a Korean brand, and so I have this much larger color variety to pick and choose from when it comes to this second portrait painting. It would be unfair to compare the color options of these two brands when I have such a skewed selection, so I'm mostly focusing on blending techniques and texture. While these first color layers use a lot of the yellows and oranges from the 72 color box, I then used some of their more muted colors that I bought separately for blending. I love using the Mungyo oil pastels to blend into each other, often using light shades in place of a paper stump for blending. Ivory instead of white creates warmer blends, and I also use silver grey to tone down colors. Pastel grey, rose brown, pastel brown and caramel are some of my most used portrait colors that aren't part of the 72 color set. The Mungyo oil pastels are harder than the Arrtx pastels and need more pressure to create a creamy layer. When using the paper stumps, I had to use much more strength to push the pastels into the paper and blend them into each other. On the other hand, that means they are less messy and can create a very smooth surface to now paint on top of. Now it's time to mix the two brands together, using their strength to complete both portraits. I went in with the Arrtx oil pastels to create softer transitions, especially on Rhaenyra's face. The easiest way I can find to compare these: Mungyo are better for drawing, Arrtx for painting. I loved having the smooth surface of the Mungyo pastels in place to then paint on top of. Since I have so many more colors of the Mungyo pastels, that also made it easier to create that intense yellow color palette for this portrait and then work the Arrtx pastels into it. I really like this combination, the control and smoothness of Mungyo as a base and the Arrtx for the painterly textured layers on top, and I think the two complement each other wonderfully. The final details were especially satisfying to paint. After that test painting was finished, I went back to Baela. Painting two portraits next to each other like this helps with seeing mistakes. In this case, I really didn't like how I'd exaggerated the highlights and overall contrast. I went back in to tone down those highlights and also painted over that greyish looking light brown I'd mentioned in the beginning some more. Then I used the Mungyo oil pastels to add more subtle color variation and also to use them as blending tools. This was a fun experiment and I'm actually really happy with this technique. The Mungyo leaving less of their color behind, since they are harder and less buttery, means that I could create halftones and smudge the Arrtx oil pastels without overpowering them. Like a paper stump with a hint of color to it. I switched back and forth between the two brands, adding heavier color with Arrtx and then blending into that with the Mungyo, especially using those pastel shades. I'm working on a compilation video of different varnish and fixative options for oil pastels, and I hope I can get back to you with that one soon. I also used a single Caran-d'Ache NeoPastel in white to blend, similar to the Mungyo, but since the NeoPastels are a bit thinner, this one worked better for details like the eyes or highlighted areas. But the final highlights got added with the Arrtx pastels again for that creamy impasto finish and completely opaque white. I cleaned up some of those stray oil pastel dust motes with a paper stump and then let the portraits dry for a few days. I'll be using fixative spray on them, but if that gets sprayed on immediately, the pastels are sealed underneath and can't air dry at all. For a final comparison, I loved combining these two pastels as they have very different advantages and disadvantages, complementing each other really well. Which one do you prefer? The mostly Arrtx portrait had more interesting textures, and I love how these look like brush strokes in an oil painting. But they were harder to control, and I think I messed up the proportion of Baela's face a lot, as I was so focused on blending. On the other hand, the mostly Mungyo portrait felt more straightforward, with that very smooth and simple first color layer, but the textures didn't create that same interesting effect. I think finding an oil pastel brand that sells single colors that's easily accessible with a large color selection overall, and then combining that with the Arrtx oil pastels that sadly only come as a box set but have this amazing texture, can be a balanced approach and suits me really well, and I'm excited to paint more with both of these in combination. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope this was helpful if you're looking into oil pastel mixed media techniques, and I hope to see you in my next art video.